My dad, bless his heart, just wanted to grill in peace. He'd spent decades in some of the sketchiest, most forgotten corners of the country, navigating worlds of betrayal and violence that most people only glimpse in movies. After all that, all he craved was a quiet backyard, the smoky perfume of a perfectly seasoned rack of ribs on his beloved smoker, and maybe a cold drink in a chair that didn't have to face the door. We'd barely unpacked the last of the boxes, just 2 days after moving into what we genuinely thought was our dream cul-de-sac, when the first shot of a very different kind of war was fired. The HOA president, a woman named Carol whose smile was a masterclass in passive aggression, slid a neon pink citation under our front door. Her claim, printed in an offensively cheerful font, our mailbox, a standard, brand-new, black metal box, was 3 inches too ebony. I'm not kidding. Too ebony. Dad, being Dad, just held it up to the light, allowed a low chuckle, and hung it on the fridge with a magnet from a long-forgotten case, like it was some bizarre piece of modern art. He went right back to applying his secret spice rub to those ribs. That laugh, that quiet act of defiance, it cost us. It ultimately cost us $15,000 in wildly escalating, completely fabricated fines, terrifying, official threat of a lien on our brand-new home, and one particularly nasty, anonymous letter that chillingly ended with the typed-out words, "We have ways of making your kind leave." What they didn't know, what they absolutely couldn't fathom in their little fiefdom of beige, was that my dad still carried the badge, not literally, but in his very bones, the same instincts that had dismantled an international arms ring in Detroit and brought down a cartel in Miami. So grab a seat and get comfortable, because this gets wild, faster than you can say cease and desist. Picture it, a picture-perfect suburban street. I mean, it looked like a movie set. Sun-drenched lawns, all cut to the exact same height. The gentle, rhythmic drone of sprinklers misting the afternoon air. Kids on bikes leaving bright chalk rainbows on the warm asphalt. It's the kind of scene that screams tranquility, the physical embodiment of the American dream, right? Now, overlay that image with a silver-haired woman in a powder blue tracksuit, clipboard clutched to her chest like a riot shield, her face a mask of self-righteous indignation. She's knocking sharply on our front door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet afternoon. She's rattling off a litany of supposed violations to my mother, who is just standing there bewildered. That's the Karen of our story, the HOA president. But then picture my dad. He's out back, deeply immersed in the sacred ritual of barbecue, tongs in one hand, a basting brush in the other, a small smudge of barbecue sauce accenting his cheek. He hears the sharp knocking, hears the rising, shrill pitch of her voice carrying through the open kitchen window. He slowly, deliberately, places his tongs and brush on the prep table. He takes a clean rag, wipes that smudge of barbecue sauce on the faded, well-loved, dark blue FBI polo he's wearing, and walks through the house. He opens the front door, calm, almost unnerving stillness about him, and says, in a voice that brooks no argument, a voice I'd heard him use exactly twice in my life, "Ma'am, you've got 5 seconds to get off my porch." She didn't. She actually puffed out her chest, clipboard still poised, ready to unleash more bureaucratic fury. And that's when Dad smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, not by a long shot. It was the kind of smile that meant file boxes full of evidence, the low, electronic hum of wiretaps, the quiet, methodical planning of a federal task force rolling in at dawn. You still think HOAs only bully people about grass height? Trust me, after this, you'll never look at your neighborhood association the same way again. Keep listening, because this goes deeper than you think. The dream. My dad, a man of quiet strength and unwavering principle, spent 23 years living a life most of us only see in movies. He was undercover. 23 years where his name wasn't his own, where every handshake could be a trap, every friendly smile a lie, every single day a high-wire act between bringing criminals to justice and disappearing into oblivion. He carried the weight of that life in his shoulders, in the way he always sat with his back to a wall in restaurants. So when he finally retired, the only thing he truly yearned for wasn't a fancy yacht or a golf membership. All he wanted was simple, profound peace. He dreamed of a garage big enough for his woodworking bench, a place where he could tinker and create, losing himself in the smell of sawdust instead of the metallic scent of danger. He dreamt of a neighborhood where his twin daughters, my sisters, could ride their bikes freely, without the distant wail of sirens or the gnawing fear of drive-bys that had been the background noise of our lives for too long. My mom, ever the pragmatist and the dreamer, found it. After months of searching, she found the one. A perfect 3-bedroom, 2-bath, granite countertop paradise on a quiet cul-de-sac. It was everything they'd ever envisioned for their golden years. They emptied their savings, poured every last dime they had into the down payment, and at the closing, my mom and dad high-fived, a gesture so uncharacteristically goofy for my dad that it made us all laugh. They promised each other, with tears welling in their eyes, no more sirens. Their first week there, a neighbor brought over a welcome basket. It was lovely, actually. Homemade lemon bars that were absolutely delicious, and a bottle of local wine. But nestled right beside them, coiled like a snake, was a 30-page rulebook, bound and stapled, thicker than Dad's entire federal pension file. He'd flip through it, a weary laugh escaping his lips. The covenants in here read more like a prison manual than a guide for community living, he joked. We all laughed then. That joke, tragically, aged very, very badly. The paper war. It started subtly, insidiously, like a slow-acting poison. A week after the mailbox incident, a crisp white envelope appeared, taped to our door. A notice claiming our cheerful red flower pots on the front porch clashed with the board-approved earth tone palette. Dad, wanting to be a good neighbor, ever the peacemaker in retirement, just sighed. Spent a Saturday repainting them a soul-crushing shade of muted beige, and we thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Next came a formal warning that our beloved golden retriever, Buster, whose bark was more a joyous hello than an aggressive challenge, had been measured with a decibel meter from the street and registered 3 decibels over the community serenity ordinance. 3 decibels. Dad, completely exasperated but still trying to play by their insane rules, bought a remote-controlled shock collar. Buster, confused and heartbroken, stopped barking. He mostly just slept after that, a sad, quiet lump of golden fur, his spirit visibly diminished. The whole family felt it, but the fines kept coming, relentless as a summer storm. A $50 fine for leaving the garbage cans at the curb for 20 minutes past the designated pickup time. A $100 fine for unauthorized sidewalk art, when my sisters drew a hopscotch grid in chalk. By month 4, the HOA had graduated from petty aesthetic quibbles to outright absurdities. They claimed our Honda Civic, a spotless, silver, perfectly reliable 5-year-old family car, was an unauthorized commercial vehicle, and therefore had to be parked in the garage at all times. Their reasoning? Because Dad had once used it to drive to an FBI community outreach event at a local high school, and a neighbor had taken a picture of him next to it with the school's banner in the background. The fine hit us with the weight of a sledgehammer, $500. My mom's hands, usually so steady, visibly shook as she read the letter. Dad's jaw, however, tightened. It was the same telltale sign, that subtle clenching of muscle, that we'd learned to recognize from old family stories. The way his jaw would set just before he had to kick down a door in the seedier parts of Detroit. The game had just changed. He wasn't a retiree trying to be a good neighbor anymore. He was a federal agent who'd been poked one too many times. The racist clause. One restless night, the accumulation of fines, the constant harassment, and the thinly veiled threats finally pushed Dad past his breaking point. He couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., he went downstairs. Instead of getting a glass of water, he pulled out that thick, 30-page rulebook, the document he'd initially dismissed as a joke, and began digging. He spent hours hunched over the kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating the dense pages, poring over every tedious paragraph, every convoluted subsection and addendum. He was no longer a homeowner. He was an investigator on a mission. And then, buried deep on page 42 of an appendix, a section that hadn't been in the original bylaws, but had been quietly slipped in during a 1998 amendment. He found it. A clause seemingly innocuous to an untrained eye. No Section 8 or government-subsidized tenancy permitted within the community association's jurisdiction. The words, so dry and bureaucratic, hit Dad like a physical blow. He knew instinctively what this meant. This wasn't about property values. This was a weapon. He spent the rest of the night cross-referencing HOA board statewide, using old database access credentials that were probably no longer authorized, pulling up similar documents online. The same language, or thinly veiled variations of it, appeared in the bylaws of dozens of other affluent communities. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic, discriminatory blueprint. He knew, from his years of investigating organized crime, that this seemingly neutral policy quietly, but effectively, erased 93% of black applicants in our county from ever even considering living in neighborhoods like ours. It was a backdoor way of maintaining racial segregation, a cruel and cowardly echo of redlining in a modern suburb. The next morning, fueled by a righteous, cold anger that had been simmering for months, he drove straight to the regional office of HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a stack of meticulously organized files clutched in his hand. The agent at the front desk, a young woman just starting her career, looked up, and her eyes went wide. She almost dropped her coffee mug. You're Agent Miller," she stammered, recognizing him from the nationally televised cartel takedown press conference from years ago. Dad, cutting straight to the chase, didn't mince words. "I need a task force," he stated, his voice low but firm. Not a handshake, not a referral, not a pamphlet. A task force. And in a testament to his reputation, his past, and the gravity of the evidence he presented, they gave him both. The threat, the HOA, emboldened by their perceived victory in the paper war, and completely oblivious to the storm brewing, escalated their tactics. Their cruelty demonstrated shocking disregard for common decency or the law. Their next move was a $10,000 architectural noncompliance fee for the brand new basketball hoop over our garage. A simple, regulation-sized hoop placed there so my sisters could practice for their middle school team. The letter that accompanied this exorbitant fine wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. It clearly stated that if the fine wasn't paid within 30 days, a lien would be placed on our home. It even included a preliminary auction date. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal, vindictive, and aimed at driving us out. Dad, ever the master of strategy, decided to try diplomacy one last time. To get them on record, he showed up at the monthly HOA meeting, held in a stuffy, windowless community room. He was dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, a polite, almost deferential smile on his face. He wanted to understand, to reason, to give them one last chance to be human. But the board president, Carol, a woman whose power seemed to inflate with every dollar she fined, merely sneered from her seat at the head of the table. "People like you," she spat, her voice dripping with condescension as my dad calmly tried to explain the situation. "Always cry discrimination when you can't be bothered to follow simple rules. Maybe this community just isn't the right fit for you." What she didn't know, what she couldn't see, was the tiny pen clipped to Dad's shirt pocket, its lens quietly recording every single syllable of her prejudiced rant. That night, after the girls were asleep, Dad made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not to a friend. He called a secure line at Quantico, his old stomping grounds. "Martinez," he said when the call was answered. "It's Miller. I need wiretaps, and I need your best forensic accountants." There was a pause on the other end, then a familiar, gruff voice, slightly amused, slightly concerned. "You're a tired old man. You're supposed to be playing golf." Dad's response was immediate, resolute. "I'm also pissed." The next morning, true to the unspoken code of the Bureau, 6 agents from Quantico, his former colleagues and friends, were at our doorstep by sunrise, looking like they were ready for a business meeting. The battle lines were officially drawn. The task force, our suburban basement, once a musty haven of dusty boxes, holiday decorations, and forgotten childhood toys, was swiftly and efficiently transformed into a veritable federal command center. White bards on wheels appeared, soon covered in complex flowcharts, names, and arrows connecting shell corporations. A bank of encrypted laptops hummed with constant activity, their screens filled with spreadsheets and legal documents. Boxes upon boxes of subpoenas, crisp and official with federal seals, were stacked neatly against a wall. To the outside world, to our unsuspecting neighbors, it must have looked like Dad had finally started that private security consulting gig he'd always talked about. Karen from next door, bless her oblivious heart, kept leaving flyers for whitening toothpaste and local bake sales on our porch, completely unaware of the full-scale federal operation unfolding directly beneath her feet. Inside, however, a very different kind of work was underway. The agents, precise and methodical, began the painstaking process of mapping the HOA's intricate financial web. What they uncovered was a shocking and audacious tapestry of corruption. They found embezzled homeowner dues being funneled into personal accounts, a blatant kickback scheme with a crooked management company, and a complex network of dummy landscaping and repair contractors, all registered under the board president's maiden name. The total skim, the amount they had systematically stolen from their own neighbors, a staggering $2.4 million since 2016. Dad wanted cuffs. He wanted immediate arrests and perp walks. But HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, had a broader, more strategic goal in mind. They wanted to establish a legal precedent, a landmark case, a hammer that would resonate beyond our cul-de-sac and send a clear, terrifying message to other discriminatory HOAs nationwide. So, after a tense conference call between Dad and a team of HUD lawyers, they compromised. They would file sweeping civil rights charges first, hitting them hard on the discrimination front, and simultaneously petition a federal judge to freeze every single one of their known assets. The net was closing in. The sting. With the evidence meticulously gathered and legally airtight, it was time for the final act. Dad, who always had a flair for the dramatic when duty called, extended a personal invitation to the entire HOA board for a casual landscaping feedback cookout at our house. The scene was almost surreal. Burgers and hot dogs sizzled on the grill, their smoky aroma filling the humid evening air. My sisters and their friends splashed joyfully in the pool, their laughter echoing through the backyard. Every single trustee, completely oblivious to the impending doom, showed up. They clutched frosty beers, made small talk about property values, and patted my dad on the back for being such a good sport. Every trustee, that is, except the vice president, who, true to form, couldn't resist pulling my mom aside to lecture her about our unapproved patio string lights. Meanwhile, unseen and unheard, several of Dad's former colleagues, now posing as catering staff in crisp white polos, circulated among the guests, smiling and refreshing drinks, while Dad flipped burgers and feigned polite interest in a conversation about crabgrass. Other agents were 3 streets away, quietly and efficiently executing a search warrant, making a complete mirror image copy of all the hard drive data from the HOA's main office. By sunset, just as the last of the board members was leaving with a plate of leftovers, the feds had everything. It was more than enough to indict all 7 board members for a litany of federal charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, embezzlement, and, most crucially, a pattern of intentional racial discrimination under the Fair Housing Act. Simultaneously, they executed the judge's order, freezing 11 separate bank accounts tied to the HOA and the board members personally. The HOA lawyer, a man who had previously dismissed Dad with a condescending chuckle during a phone call, called him, screaming, his voice a panicked, high-pitched shriek. Dad, calm as a summer breeze, simply lifted his phone to his ear, listened for a moment, and replied, with a faint, knowing smile, "You've reached a retired number. Leave a message after the beep." The silence on the other end was deafening. The fallout. The news hit our sleepy suburb like a bombshell. Headlines exploded across local and even national news outlets. Suburban HOA board faces federal charges after taunting former FBI agent. The story, with its potent mix of petty tyranny, racial injustice, and righteous, almost cinematic federal intervention, went viral. The HOA attorneys, a high-priced firm, that had once been so arrogant and dismissive were now practically camping out on the steps of the U.S. Attorney's office, begging for a deal. Their carefully constructed legal defenses were crumbling like sandcastles against a tidal wave. But HUD, having seen the deeply systemic nature of the discrimination, refused to budge. They held firm, demanding nothing less than full and total capitulation. Every single discriminatory rule had to be publicly identified and shredded. Every dollar of the illegally levied fines had to be refunded with interest, and a full public apology had to be printed on the front page of the local paper. The board members, their lives suddenly and spectacularly unraveling, resigned in disgrace. They were forced to sell their luxury cars, their boats, their vacation homes, desperately trying to raise money for their mounting criminal lawyer fees. The Karen president, Carol, who had initiated this entire nightmare over a mailbox, tried to plead old age and infirmity in her bond hearing, hoping for leniency. The judge, however, woman who had clearly read the details of the case, was visibly unmoved by her crocodile tears. She set bail at a cool $1 million cash. It was a clear, unequivocal message. My sisters, who had witnessed so much of the stress and injustice firsthand, now rode their bikes past her house on their way to school, chanting, with a gleeful innocence that was both hilarious and a little dark, "Mailbox justice, mailbox justice." Dad, ever the one to teach restraint even in victory, told them to stop. He was too busy smiling. It was a deep, satisfied, hard-won smile that reached all the way to his eyes. The aftermath. In the wake of the scandal, our community slowly, painfully, and awkwardly began to heal. The court ordered new elections, which brought in a wave of neighbors who actually waved back, who smiled, who genuinely cared about fostering a true sense of community rather than wielding petty power. At their first meeting, they voted overwhelmingly to fire the corrupt management company, to refund our 15 grand down to the last penny, and as a powerful symbolic gesture, they offered to let Dad personally choose the new color for the community entrance sign. He picked the exact same 2 ebony shade of black that had started this whole ridiculous saga, a quiet, powerful reclaiming of the narrative that wasn't lost on anyone. Mom, who had endured so much silent stress and worry, who had watched our savings dwindle and the threat of losing our home become terrifyingly real, cried happy tears the day the twins, emboldened by the victory and the new atmosphere of freedom, asked if they could finally chalk "Black Lives Matter" in big, bright letters at the end of our driveway. Dad just looked at them, and then at Mom, and nodded, his eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, glistening with unshed tears. That night, and for the first time since his retirement, for the first time since leaving the high-stakes world of federal law enforcement, he slept past 6 a.m. The weight, the constant, gnawing burden of injustice, had finally been lifted from our home. If you've ever felt that gut-wrenching punch, that sickening dread opening a citation from an overzealous HOA, then you absolutely have to share this story. Let's send a message. Drop a comment below and tell us about the pettiest, most infuriating fine you've ever received. Hit that like button so the YouTube algorithm knows that HOA drama, when it's about real justice and not just about lawn height, absolutely rocks. And please subscribe for more justice reels, because next month we're diving deep into the story of the condo board that had the audacity to tow a paramedic's car from its designated spot in the middle of her 12-hour shift. You won't want to miss that. HOAs, in their worst iterations, bank on your silence. They thrive in the shadows of bureaucracy, trading intimidation for compliance, wielding fines as weapons, and leveraging fear to maintain their often unjust power over your own home. They assume you're too tired, too busy, or too scared to fight back. But sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet guy flipping ribs at the neighborhood cookout is the same guy who served high-risk warrants in 3 different states. Sometimes, quiet dad coaching t-ball on a Saturday morning is capable of getting a federal judge to freeze your assets before you even finish your breakfast. Discrimination, in all its ugly forms, from the overt to the insidiously bureaucratic, ultimately loses when ordinary people, or in our case, extraordinary former agents, understand their rights and weaponize the law. So read those covenants, scrutinize those bylaws, and for goodness sake, record those meetings. And if they push too far, if they cross that fundamental line of decency and fairness, remember this: you might just be one neighbor away from an FBI task force setting up shop in your basement. And if that neighbor happens to be my dad, well, you might want to pack some serious sunscreen, because the spotlight the feds bring to bear burns incredibly, blindingly hot. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.